and speaking of the RCMP, why hasn't there been an investigation, or shouldn't we be demanding an investigation then, if indeed that we feel there's bodies that have been buried from murdered children?
Well, my understanding is that at Kamloops, the RCMP did in fact begin an investigation, and I don't know all the details of this, Corey, but it's a very serious matter. Apparently, they were personally contacted, I believe, by the former TRC chair, Murray Sinclair, who basically told them to lay off. And amazingly, they did. Now, this is, I don't know all the details of this, and I don't want to give any misinformation, but that is my understanding. Now, this, to me, it seems like a very serious business. If the RCMP are contacted by somebody who says, well, please lay off this murder investigation for whatever reason, the RCMP would normally simply say, I'm sorry, we'll just do our job as we see fit. And that didn't happen in this case. Now, there is a call to action in the TRC report that basically says, well, Indigenous communities should be able to do their own burial site investigations. Well, that makes a certain amount of a sense if you were looking for ancient relics or something like that. But if we're talking about an allegation of what is really a mass murder here, 215 secret burials by night, where somehow the Catholic clergy, this would be the priests and nuns who were at the Kamloops school, had somehow caused the death of children, and then somehow decided they would be secretly buried with the help of 6-year-olds. This would be the biggest crime in Canadian history. And of course, the RCMP should immediately go into the area. They should secure the area and then do their investigation. After all, some of the people, these 6-year-olds that apparently were forced to dig graves, well, goodness, they would still be around. I don't know how old they would be, but they would still be around. Obviously, these supposedly occurred in the 1950s and 60s, so some of these people would be alive. Why the RCMP have not actually properly investigated, I do not understand. And I think Canadians should demand that the RCMP do their job, take over the investigation even at this late stage, and that would definitely involve securing the area properly and then excavating if they believed that there was enough evidence.
Yeah, and just to clarify a little more, one of our commenters, Paulette Burgard, saying what is TRC? And that's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right?
Yes, that's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which reported in 2015. And I can just jump right into the genocide question if you want, Corey, because we've had so much of that now in the news, and I think some simple facts would be useful for your viewers, and I'll try not to give many numbers here, but we have the story that 150,000 Indigenous children were forced to attend residential schools, and that fits into the genocide definition. In other words, if you take 150,000 children and force them into schools and indoctrinate them, yeah, that probably would be called cultural genocide or even genocide. But none of that is true. And the CBC and CTV is just as bad, and even the mainstream newspapers keep repeating this misinformation. So I just thought I'd let you know, I think, where this comes from. The TRC, that is the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners, made a speech to the United Nations a number of years ago, before the TRC hearings even began. And there they said 150,000, for 7 generations, 150,000 Indigenous children were forced to attend residential schools. And then they went on to list all the terrible things that had happened. This is in advance of even doing the hearings to get the evidence, which is shocking in itself. But every part of that statement is not true. In the first place, the idea that every Indigenous child that went to residential school is just demonstrably false. Here are the figures. In the peak years of enrollment, 1/3 of status Indian children went to residential schools. And in some of the years, beginning and later, it was as little as 1/6. So you could say between 1/6 and 1/3 of the status Indians went to residential schools. But if you're talking about Indigenous children, which includes Métis and non-status and Inuit, the percentage is much lower than that. It's actually between like 1/12 and 1/6. And if you want to get to go further into how many were Catholic, about half of the students were Catholic. You had something like between 1/24 and 1/12 who actually went to residential schools. Now that's a tiny, tiny number. And you have to ask yourself, well, how could you possibly make a claim that there had been a cultural genocide or genocide when so few of the children actually went to the schools? But it gets worse, because the idea that these children were all forced to attend is nonsense. And I'll not go into too much detail here, but Corey, before 1920, there was no compulsory attendance at all, mandatory attendance for status Indian children. This means that a parent, an Indigenous parent, was not under any type of legal compulsion to send their children to school. And yet at least some of them did. Some of the parents chose to send their children to day schools. Some chose to send their children to residential schools. And many Indigenous children, most at that time, didn't go to any school at all. So that was complete choice. The Catholic parents would choose to send their children to a Catholic residential school. Protestant parents, because most Indians were Christian at that time, Protestant parents would choose a Protestant school. So that was not forced. These parents were under no compulsion at all. Now, after 1920, there was compulsory attendance. By that time, there was compulsory attendance in all parts of Canada. And the law said that an Indigenous parent, or pardon me, a status Indian parent, had to choose either a day school or a residential school and send their children to one of those schools. And the only people that were actually compelled to send their children to a residential school were those that did not live near a day school. So that's where the law stayed. And it is completely false that all of these children were forced to attend. We have applications. My group has many applications which were made by Indigenous parents that were refused. That is, the residential school said, sorry, we're full. We just don't have enough space for you. These are parents that wanted their children to attend. And before you ask another question, let me just give you one example that comes to mind that makes this very clear. In the 1930s, the Cross Lake Residential School was burned to the ground in Manitoba. Probably Manitoba's worst crime of all time. 12 Indian children were killed, and one nun was killed. And the federal government, this was the Depression, didn't want to rebuild the school for money reasons. It was going to be expensive. And so the school was not reopened, and the parents started sending their children to the day schools. Well, the parents, these are the Indigenous parents parents got together and they signed a petition and presented it to the federal government demanding that the school be rebuilt. And they explained in that petition that day schools were simply inadequate in not providing the quality of education for the children that they felt was necessary. And after receiving that petition, the federal government did go and rebuild that school. So that is absolute proof that the Indigenous parents were very much involved with the education of their children, and in some cases, in many cases, preferred residential schools to day schools. And maybe I should just let you ask some questions and jump in here, Corey.
Oh, that's all right. And there's so many numbers and things going around right now, a lot of exaggerations. And actually, I got a correction sent to me by Jaime Rubenstein, who I had on the other week, because I had my numbers mixed up with how many children, perhaps, because some did pass away while in the care of residential schools. And the number from the Truth and Reconciliation report, anyways, is 832. And again, this is over the course of the better part of a century, and with 150,000 children. So, and in times when mortality was unfortunately a lot higher for children than today. So again, we're not getting into the realm of genocide, even if people like lightly throwing that term out there.
No, and the 832 is even very interesting. I know there are a few hundred that died in hospitals afterwards, and there were other numbers that they sort of arbitrarily added to that list. But it's really important to understand that most of those 832 died of tuberculosis, and they had that tuberculosis when they first entered residential schools. That's the evidence of Dr. Peter Bryce, who is usually quoted on these things. So the important thing there is disease was an unfortunate fact of life in those days, and it was very sad that the disease death rate on reserves was far higher than in the general population, and that naturally follows that it would also be far higher in residential schools. And instead of saying, well, what is the rate of death at residential schools compared to the rate of death on the reserves, which is the proper comparison, what we always see in newspapers is, well, the rate of death at residential schools was 5 times higher than at other schools. Well, that's absolutely true, but those children at the other schools did not come from reserves. It was the reserves that, for many historical reasons, had a very high death rate from disease, particularly tuberculosis and influenza in those years.
Yeah, so kind of pivoting back, to the apparent or alleged 215, or I see they've even sort of backed down and said, well, maybe it's 200, but it's the anomalies found with the GPR and in Kamloops, where it's felt that there were perhaps that many bodies secretly buried. I mean, that's a significant chunk on top of the 832 known. Again, I mean, Truth and Reconciliation, I wouldn't realize that commission would have the ability to tell the police what they can or can't investigate. And you would think, I mean, truth is the term in it. If people thought there were murders going on, they should be screaming at the police to get in there and get investigating as soon as possible. It just seems very counterintuitive that we aren't getting in there if we really thought a crime was happening. As you said, it wasn't that relatively long ago. The perpetrators might still be alive. We should be following up on this. And so far, there's not a teaspoon of dirt's moved.
Well, I don't understand this. I don't understand what is happening with the RCMP. It seems that political interference here of some type is warping things at the top. But there's no question in my mind that when somebody makes an allegation of mass murder and secret burial, whether that person is Indigenous or anything else, then the RCMP in a rural area have the duty to immediately investigate. Because if they just let these allegations go, you get what we have today, where these claims are coming in all over the place, and people are doing do-it-yourself investigations in their own communities, and this is very wrong. This is Canada. There should be one policing policy that applies to all of Canada, and it's very clear to me that the RCMP should immediately, even at this very late stage, say no. We don't let people do their own murder investigations. That's our job, and then get in there.
Well, you know, it makes sense with something as potentially serious as this, but do you think we're ever going to see a forensic investigation, or are we just going to let those alleged grave sites sit as they stand in speculation?
Well, I'll give a prediction here. None of these communities that are alleging that there are these secret burials and with all of these crazy stories about priests secretly burying children and throwing them into furnaces and that sort of thing, I'm predicting that none of them are going to excavate. They will hide behind claims of jurisdiction. They'll hide behind claims that, no, this is sacred land and we've made these sensational allegations, but we're not going to do anything about them. There will be many other excuses given, but no excavations will take place. Because if they did, what they would find is exactly what they found, where the RCMP did do investigations. I mentioned that Shabnekady school in Nova Scotia, for instance, where there were these same crazy claims about priests secretly burying children and that sort of thing. And the RCMP investigated, and they found, yes, there were graves, but those were graves of Irish settlers who had died 100 years before the school was even built. And there are 3 other places where similar things occurred. So there's a type of, and I don't understand this, Corey, but there's a type of hysteria which has taken hold in some of the Indigenous communities. And that's why I don't call this whole missing children thing a hoax, because many of these unsophisticated people actually believe what they're talking about. They believe that there are indeed thousands of children that were murdered in horrible ways at residential schools. These are simply conspiracy theories, urban myths, ghost stories, whatever you call them, but they are not true. And they've been stoked by some very unscrupulous people. And now we have people who I call genocide hustlers, who are determined to label Canada as a genocidal nation, which it is not and has never been. So there's simply some very bad information out there, and for reasons that are not clear to me, the mainstream media seems to be to feel no obligation to start reporting on these things honestly.
Yeah, well, we are seeing at least more reporting coming out and more calls, questioning the official line. I mean, we heard none of that in the first 6 months because everybody was horrified and felt that, wow, if this is really happening, we certainly don't want to question it. But it's been 14 months. I mean, we need to see some resolution here. So I guess we just keep the pressure up and keep bringing it up until hopefully, as you said, you don't sound optimistic, but we can try and force the law to be applied and see what happens.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on again to talk to me today. And I suspect this story will be going on for quite a while. Hopefully we can get you on again because I don't plan on letting it go. I'm stubborn with this one because we got a real travesty hanging out there, and we'll just keep pressuring and examining and reading into this until we get some resolution, I think.
Yeah, and thanks for inviting me. And I would just invite watchers or viewers to check out everything I've said, but don't go to sources like Wikipedia and many of the other reports. Go to primary sources. Go to the actual government record so you get the straight information, because there's a great deal of misinformation on this field. Okay, thanks, Corey, and good to talk to you.